We're going to take a look at the neurotransmitters used in the autonomic nervous system, and we're going to start with acetylcholine. The two neurotransmitters that are used by the autonomic nervous system are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And then the hormones that the autonomic nervous system releases from the adrenal medulla are epinephrine and also a little bit of norepinephrine, and then also a tiny amount of dopamine, but it's such a small amount that I just didn't put it on here. And the important thing to remember is that it's the type of the receptor that determines the response and not the neurotransmitter. So let's take a look at the location of the neurotransmitters that are used in the autonomic nervous system. We have everything written down here, but I think it's easier if we just take a look at a picture. And one thing that I'm not going to ask you, I will not ask you this one here. The sweat glands, did not read the textbook. They're kind of an exception here. They're not following the rules because sympathetic postganglionic neurons will use norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter, but here these are using acetylcholine, but I won't ask you that. All right, so let's just take a look at this drawing here, and we're going to label what neurotransmitters are being released where. So this would be really easy for me to ask you questions about this on the exam. So I've got the sympathetic nervous system up here on the top, and then parasympathetic nervous system, and then the somatic nervous system as well. So let's start with the sympathetic nervous system at the top here. Notice we've got the short preganglionic neuron, and then we've got a long postganglionic neuron. And the preganglionic neuron here is going to be releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, we've got a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron, so it's just the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. And its preganglionic neuron is also going to release acetylcholine. So kind of a rule of thumb that you can remember for the exam is that all autonomic preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitters. So it doesn't matter if it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, any of the autonomic preganglionic neurons are going to be releasing acetylcholine. And then for the somatic motor neuron here, it's also going to be releasing acetylcholine. All right, and then one other place that we are going to be releasing acetylcholine is from the postganglionic parasympathetic neuron. So it'll use acetylcholine to talk to its target organ, whether that's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. All right, so I would memorize these, know which neurotransmitter is being released where, because that's a really easy question for me to ask on the exam. All right, and then this is just a picture from your book looking at the neurotransmitters released by the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you just remember that both the pre and the postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system, both of these are going to be releasing acetylcholine. So that's easy to remember. And then for the sympathetic nervous system, it's just the preganglionic neuron that will release acetylcholine. Okay, and then the postganglionic neuron is going to be releasing norepinephrine. And then if it's innervating the adrenal medulla is going to release mostly epinephrine as the hormone, and then a little bit of norepinephrine, and then a tiny amount of dopamine. All right, so let's take a look at the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And remember that acetylcholine is going to bind to two different types of cholinergic receptors. So we learned about these before. We have the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So those are ionotropic receptors. They're ligand-gated ion channels. So when acetylcholine binds, that'll open the gate, and we're going to actually let sodium ions into the cell, and that's always going to be excitatory. So we're going to create an EPSP. And they're called nicotinic cholinergic receptors because nicotine will also bind to these receptors and open the gate. The other type of cholinergic receptors that acetylcholine will bind to are the muscarinic cholinergic receptors. These are very different because they're metabotropic receptors. They're G protein linked receptors. So they can be either excitatory or inhibitory depending on what the G protein goes and does. They're called muscarinic cholinergic receptors because muscarine, which is a toxin from some toxic mushrooms, will also bind to these receptors and activate the G protein. So that's how they got their name. All right, so let's just take a look at a picture of a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. We've got acetylcholine binding to this ligand-gated ion channel. We'll open the gate here in the middle, and then mostly sodium ions are going to come into the cell. And if you have sodium ions coming into the cell, that's going to create a depolarizing graded potential or an EPSP. So that's going to be excitatory. So it's going to bring the cell closer to threshold. And then the muscarinic cholinergic receptors are metabotropic receptors. They're G protein linked receptors. So here we have acetylcholine binding to our muscarinic cholinergic receptor or G protein linked receptor. And that'll activate the G protein, and the G protein can do one of two things. So it could take off and open or close an ion channel, or it could go and turn an enzyme on and make some second messengers. So it could do either of those things, and depending on what the G protein does, it could cause an excitatory or inhibitory response. So it could cause either an EPSP or an IPSP, so it just depends. All right, so important to remember that it's the receptor that determines the response, not the neurotransmitter. Okay, so that's a really important concept to remember because you've got the same neurotransmitter here, acetylcholine, but you have very different responses in the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle to the same neurotransmitter, and that's because they have different receptors. So in skeletal muscle, acetylcholine is going to be binding to this nicotinic cholinergic receptor, which is going to let sodium ions in, and that'll depolarize the skeletal muscle cell and lead to contraction. And so that'll excite the skeletal muscle cell. Whereas acetylcholine, when it binds to the muscarinic cholinergic receptor in cardiac muscle, the G protein will take off and actually open a potassium channel, and that'll let potassium ions out, and that will hyperpolarize the cell and create an IPSP. And so that will inhibit the cardiac muscle contraction, and that will slow the heart rate down. And so you have opposite effects in skeletal and cardiac muscle from the same neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and that's because there's different receptors that the acetylcholine is binding to. So important to remember, it's the receptor that determines the response and not the neurotransmitter. Right, and then just remembering that at these cholinergic synapses, after the acetylcholine has been released, how we get rid of it is with the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is located right in the synaptic cleft. And so the acetylcholine is going to be very short-acting. It's not going to hang around very long because it's going to be broken down very quickly by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Okay, and then as far as where these cholinergic receptors are going to be located, so let's go over that. I will not ask you about the sweat glands, so do not worry about that. Okay, but the others I will ask you about. So this is all from your book, but let's just draw a picture of this out. Okay, so we've got sympathetic nervous system up here on the top. We've got acetylcholine being released from the preganglionic neuron. And on this postganglionic neuron on the dendrites and the soma, acetylcholine is going to bind to nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Okay, and we're also going to see that on the parasympathetic nervous system as well, because the preganglionic neuron is also going to be releasing acetylcholine. And so on this postganglionic neuron, the dendrites and the soma, we're also going to have the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Okay, and then also in the somatic nervous system, on the skeletal muscle cells, the acetylcholine released by this somatic lower motor neuron is going to bind to nicotinic cholinergic receptors on the skeletal muscle cells. Okay, and then just the last place we have acetylcholine being released is from the parasympathetic postganglionic neuron when it goes to talk to the target organ here. And on the parasympathetic target organ, we're going to have muscarinic cholinergic receptors instead. So I would memorize that and know where these different nicotinic and muscarinic cholinergic receptors are located. That's really important. And then we're going to talk about the receptors for norepinephrine, which is going to bind to an adrenergic receptor. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture.